you. Thank you very much. I hope you'll still be feeling like that in another 45 minutes or so. What are scheduled to have? 2 hours?
3.
Whatever.
3.
So 3? Okay. So, George, you're gracious with your remarks. You know, folks, when I hear an introduction as generous as that, I sit there thinking, gee, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say. I have a lot to say about dear old Duke. This is my 9th visitor, I think, and each time he gets more agreeable, much more agreeable than a trip I made a little while ago to Boston and what's that place on the river, now known as the Duke of the North. But I've always enjoyed coming here, and it's a big pleasure to see so many familiar faces. You haven't changed a bit over 10 years. And I might also mention that I'm here in your country on my 100th visit to the great United States. And I was much gratified that I was here for the momentous events of last week. I do believe, and this is a considered statement, there are no evidence to back it up just yet, but I do believe that last Tuesday evening was an event parallel with the fall of the Berlin Wall, or potentially parallel, a great occasion, I think. And I'm so impressed to hear from so many students who went trekking around in the evening when the day's work was done, trekking around in the pouring rain, ringing on doorbells, distributing election leaflets. Marvellous. So glad to be associated with that kind of a phenomenon. Anyway, these institutional roadblocks. When I was wondering what topic I should choose to talk to you about, I thought, well, by diversity, mass extinction, that's old hat, you've heard from Stuart a long time about that. Then I thought of subsidies, perverse with the war. And then I thought I'd take a crack at institutional roadblocks. You are only the second time that I've tried to talk about this, so it's all fresh and new and different. Well, why do I want to talk about that? Oh, it goes like this. I've long believed that the reason why the environment is declining more and more, and why other aspects of the way we run our societies that they're in trouble. I've often thought that it is not because individual citizens are stupid and mean and myopic and selfish and all those other dreadful things. My friends in the environmental arena told me that was the problem when I got into environment 40 years ago, that people are being selfish and so on and so on. But I looked around my fellow citizens, albeit in Britain, and I couldn't see that people were like that at all. And there was no doubt that things were going downhill. I would propose to you that during the last 50 years, let's say, the amount of money devoted to the environmental scene has been, whatever it was, but since then, during the past 50 years, the amount of money generated to support the environment has increased at least 5 times. Now, it might be 3 times, I doubt it, it might be 10 times, but anyway, let's say 5 times. And the amount of science devoted to the environment has increased by 5 times. And the amount of government attention, 5 times. And the amount of public support, 5 times. And yet, things are still going down the hill. Now, well, why should that be? Well, I conclude that is because we do not have an adequate set of institutional mechanisms to support us. For instance, and I'll get into this one, we'll do a more detail in a few moments. We tend to measure our understanding of lifestyle fulfillment or prosperity or GNP per head or with whichever latitude. We tend to measure we tend to assess how we are doing, as you might say, by the GNP per head. GNP, if you think about it, is a hopelessly inaccurate and in fact a downright misleading indication or measure of how we are doing. consider the GMP is the collection of all the transactions that take place in the open marketplace, but that is a highly limited definition. Consider this. Consider the citizen who's just been dreadfully burglarized. That has generated a lot of economic activities with the police and the courts and goodness knows what. All those economic activities are added on to GMP for all the world as if they are advancing human welfare. They aren't really advancing human welfare at all. They're merely getting you back to where you were before the burglary occurred. And on top of that, you might consider the person who's been involved in a horrifically expensive car crash. Again, there are more activities that are added on to GDP, simply because they are transacted in the open marketplace. And that same person might be involved in a long and hideously costly divorce, and he might have been diagnosed with long-term cancer. All those features, if you will, generate lots of economic activities, but they are not adding to human welfare. They're merely getting it back to where we were before all that stuff occurred. So the GMP is, as I say, hopelessly misleading and in fact directly distortive to our understanding of how we're doing. We'll come back to that in a bit more detail in a little while. And then there are other factors of the way we try to run our societies which are further distortive, deeply distortive. For instance, perverse subsidies. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I mentioned most of you are pretty familiar with it already. Here's a statement about GNP. I credit you, fine folks at the great Duke University. You can lead. I think it's rather an illuminating and inspiring statement, but quite accurate, but quite rigorous in its analysis. Okay? By the way, all these images are going to be left on your hard drive, Hattie's hard drive. So you get a copy, you're entirely welcome to do that, and then you can ponder all these comments at your leisure. We'll come back to GMP in a little while. Perverse subsidies, well, what are they? Well, all governments do dispense large amounts of subsidies, and by and large they're for a good purpose. But there are some subsidies which are, the government dispense a lot of subsidies, and by and large they're helpful economically, and if they cause some damage to the environment along the way, well, that's tough. We've got to figure the real priorities, the economy. If the environment gets hurt, well, tough. But there are some subsidies, it turns out, that are not only bad for the environment, but bad for the economy as well. Quite the opposite of what you might expect. And this one, for instance, in Germany, the coal mines, the coal mining subsidies are so huge that it will be economically efficient for the government to close down all the mines and send the workers home on full pay for the rest of their lives, and the economy will still come out ahead because the subsidies are so overwhelmingly large, and there'll also be damage to the environment in the form of acid rain, urban smog, global warming. This is a clear example of subsidies which are, note again, in accord with the two criteria, bad for the environment and bad for the economy as well. Look at the various sectors where most of these perverse subsidies are to be found. Can you believe? When you look at six leading sectors and total up the perverse subsidies around the world, well, when I started out on the arithmetic, I thought it would just be a few $100 billion, no big deal. What's a few $100 billion between friends? But it turns out that collectively they are worth as much as $2 trillion. Now, the total global economy is not much more than $50 trillion, so if $2 trillion are going down a rat hole, attacking the economy as well as the environment, and that will have quite a depleted effect on our economies. Note that there is $2 trillion. By definition, these funds support unsustainable development, unsustainable economically, unsustainable environmentally. They're bad news on both counts. At the Rio World Summit in 1992, a bunch of environmentalists totaled their leading up and proposed that we could switch to sustainable development at a cost of about $600 million per year, $600 million. When the governments of the world assembled in Rio saw that figure produced by the environmentalists, they said, there go those leaders again who live in cuckoo land. Where could we possibly find $600 million to support, to promote sustainable development? If they had had the sense to look at the perverse subsidies, they would have found 3.5 times as much as they need to foster sustainable development. But it's not in the way of governments to think along constructive lines like that. Moving on. So subsidies in agriculture. In Europe, a cow gets a subsidy of about $2 per day, and put that in perspective and proportion. That's a little bit more than 2.5 billion of the poorest people in this world receive every day. Well, just have a look at the figures there. The subsidies arise because of inequities in our institutional systems that they should not have been allowed to arise in the first place. And when they do arise and they get set in stone, it's the devil's own job to get rid of them. For instance, there are still huge subsidies going to support growing exploitation of coal and oil. Now, when those two lubricants, when those two resources first started to lubricate our economies a bit over 100 years ago, they played a perfectly valid role. It was fine. They helped expand the economy. But today, they're long past their shelf life. We should phase them out as fast as we can go. And I hope that President Obama will give some attention to this one. He has made some voices that he will look carefully at. Note here, in Washington, D.C., there are 16,000 lobbyists largely supporting these crazy subsidies, paying their trade at a price of $250 million per month. Then they might say, well, okay, we'll still run that. We'll still run on your argument. These perverse subsidies are very bad news. We should get rid of them. We do not have the institutional mechanisms to enable us to phase them out. If the environmental NGOs wanted to mount a campaign to lean on Congress to get rid of these subsidies, they'd be competing with this kind of pressure in the opposite direction. We have next to no institutional devices or capacities developed on a scale to take on the establishment. And there's no signs yet that the US government, like the British government, like the French government, will take steps, systematized steps to get rid of these subsidies. An example of another set of institutional whatnot going wrong. That there was no planning capacity of suitable scale and, so we say, intelligence in London throughout all the last century. More and more money was being poured into the car culture, more roads, more bridges, more this and that. And the settlement hasn't given us very much progress at all. There's another one which, well, I hesitate to use sharp terms, but it really does rather beg a belief that so much agricultural capacity is being lost to advancing deserts, and the cost of pushing back the desert will be only about half of the benefits that will be supplied if the undesertified lands were then handed over to agriculture. Another example of how governance and government systems are out of kilter with one another the district refers to Britain, where, well, no, it's a bit hard to predict now because of the British crime, but we're all saying it's an example of how the major sectors of the British government simply don't talk to each other, even though their offices are only 100 yards apart in Whitehall. Then let's move on and consider one particular sector, and that is water. The yellow blocks indicate water supplies per head in 1990, when the average, in 1990, and the people were quite thirsty in those days, and the red blocks indicate the people who might be very thirsty by 2025. This is a prediction, it's not a projection, but it's on the cards that things will work out that way. Now these people are really thirsty. It's not just that they could do a bit more water. They are critically thirsty. They use no more water each day for all purposes, that is water, sanitation, cooking and so on, no more water than we use every time we flush the toilet once. They really are very short of water. Have a look at that. An awful lot of people in this world almost never have a glass of decent quality water. And you might ask, why is it that... You might say, hey, but wait a minute, water is an intrinsically renewable resource. We should be able to recycle it time after time after time. And indeed, it's been said that in Manhattan, if you take a glass of water from the tap, it's water that is likely to have been through 2 or 3 people already. So we should be able to recycle water indefinitely. So why don't we? Well, people are consumers of water, whether municipal households or factories or agriculture. Consumers of water are encouraged to use water in a very inefficient way, to slosh it all over the place. They're encouraged to do that because of, here we go again, subsidies, albeit covert subsidies this time, that promote very wasteful use of limited, of scarce supplies of water. It makes no sense. You might say, well, why, if so many countries are short of water, well, why don't they fix the problem? Well, why don't they stop supplying these covert subsidies? And in any case, well, what do we mean by covert subsidies? Consider Egypt. There is scarcely a country in the world which is so dependent on a single natural resource as in the case of Egypt, dependent upon water. And yet the government charges consumers only 20% of the cost of supplying that water. That's a massive covert subsidy equivalent to 80% here. And of course you'll say, well, why does the government do such a crazy thing? Well, Egypt should take steps to encourage consumers to be as careful and efficient and parsimonious as they possibly can with regard to water supply. Well, why? So in other countries, Israel does quite well, 60%, but even the United States doesn't even get up to 20%. Well, why do governments do that? Well, it seems the story goes like this. The early civilizations were almost all in desertified areas, well, not desert, but in desert areas in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, the valleys of the Euphrates and the Tigris. And in those far back days, it was considered that water is so vital to essential, basic processes of life that to charge anybody for a single drop of water was intrinsically immoral, and you must never charge anybody anything for water. Well, those who came in those far back days. Today we've moved on. You know the same amount of water. In the case of the River Nile, there are now 12 times more people using the water of the Nile than in the time of Moses. The amount of water coming down the Nile is only the same as it was in the time of Moses. So there's a great premium on using water as efficiently as possible, but it doesn't work that way. Last July I flew over Nebraska at midday and saw the big irrigation gantries going round and round. sloshing water all over the place. The amount of water that gets within 2 or 3 inches of a plant's roots and hence can do its job, the amount of water is only about 15 to 25%. And the rest is wasted, even though the Ogallala aquifer needs to be conserved as efficiently as possible. Moving on, water economic. Yeah, there's the shortage of water for the great bulk of people in developing countries is not a costless phenomenon. Amount of developing nations disease due to lack of clean water, 90%. Measles and no, not measles, but malaria and the heart failure. A lot of water-related diseases. Annual cost. No, we can put a dollar value on that. It's rather unfortunate to think of these things when people are so short of water. It's rather unfortunate to look at it in dollar terms, but there's one way. We need to get an intellectual handle on what it is costing. Annual cost of work days lost because of sickness, 125 billion. A lot of money. And never mind about the next bit, but note down here, needed to supply water for all, an extra $15 billion per year. And yet, shortages of water are causing damages, if you will, of $125 billion a year. It would make sense, would it not, to get on with the job of supplying water to all and keep hacking away at that figure of $125 billion. But again, governments don't think like that. They think in a linear fashion. They don't think such sideways. They don't engage in lateral thinking. I don't suppose it's thought of it. Virtual water. This is a form of water consumption which is also quite wasteful or excessive. Can you believe that, for instance, the top left, 1 kilogram of beef, that's worth of 2 or 3 hamburgers, takes 16,000 litres of water to grow the grass or to grow the grain that is needed to raise these animals. That whole process is extremely thirsty. And notes here. Needed to grow the cotton. Cotton is about the most thirsty crop of all. Needed to grow the cotton to make just 1 t-shirt, enough water to fill 25 bathtubs. And yet the cost of using water in that rather prodigal fashion is not reflected in the price of a cotton t-shirt. We need to do much more on internalising these externalities so that the price of some product is matched by the cost. So think to yourselves, bananas for breakfast, whatever it is for lunch, maybe a steak in the evening or fish in the evening. Almost all those instances, would it not be fair to say that you're not paying the full cost? Not about a long way, we'll come back to that one in a few moments. Yes, and then the bottled water, another unfortunate story. There at the top line, UN Go. This is one of the UN Millennium Development Goals propounded in the year 2000. The aim is that by 2015 we should halve the proportion of people without safe water, even though that would be nothing to shout about as a blazing success. On the contrary, we would still have 800 million thirsty people. Cost of annual supply, remember from the previous slide, an additional $15 billion. $15 billion. But we could raise that money easily enough. All we have to do is to implement a 10-cent tax on each of the 150 billion bottles of water consumed each year. Even though bottled water is, generally speaking, a worthless luxury, hardly any healthier than tap water, and certain brands cost more than petrol on this side of the Atlantic and gasoline. So let's move on. We've looked at quite a few instances of institutional breakdown. Well, what can we do about all this story? First of all, swap GNP for a general progress indicator. We'll have a look at a graph to illustrate that in just a moment. Secondly, get the prices right, e.g. petrol or gasoline. I've been reading in the newspapers that a lot of people in this country are delighted when the price of gasoline falls to $2.50 to $2.50 per gallon. And recently it has been as much as, wow, it's been as much as $4 a gallon or even more. But again, the price that you pay at the petrol pump for a gallon of gasoline does not reflect all the costs that are entailed in burning that gallon of gasoline. There's a cost of using the roads, of course, and the road tax covers that, but not covered at all, or at least hardly at all, are items like pollution from burning gasoline, and not just CO2 emissions, but particulate emissions. There are particular particulate emissions in car exhaust that are so tiny you can't see them with the naked eye, and yet they can cause so much damage to your lungs that they are a source of more mortality than road accidents are. Well, did you ever hear about that, the cost of driving down the road? And then there's traffic accidents, another big cost of 52,000 Americans killed on the roads each year, and a huge number of badly injured. And then there's road congestion, further cost to the economy. But these costs are not reflected in the price you pay for your gasoline. What the economists call the full social cost of burning, factor in all these things like road accidents and pollution and so on. Means that the full social cost is as much as $10 or even $12 per gallon. And while that might sound beyond belief to you, it is a figure which has been arrived at by several independent teams of economists in this country who are wall-to-wall agreed that the full cost is in the order of $10 to $12. So when you're paying only $4, you're really getting a free ride on back to your fellow citizens. Number 3, phase out perverse subsidies. We'll come back to that in a moment. And number 4, expand eco-technologies to enable our economies to be run more efficiently, more equitably. We have a graph at GDP, the top line, as you know, good gross domestic product, conventional. Down here we have GPI for genuine progress indicator. Well, what do I mean by that, and why is there this big gap, and why is it widening? Well, consider this. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was a big oil tanker crash off the coast of Spain, and it was a very bad one. And the cleanup costs were in the order of $3 billion. And as I mentioned before, so some large payments don't help us don't enable us to move forward, to advance in terms of our lifestyle quality. So in the case of helping you to catch up with where you were before the oil spill or whatever it was occurred, that $3 billion should not have been added on to GDP. On the contrary, it should have been subtracted. There would have been a more rational way of looking at it. But the amount was added onto the GDP. There are also some social externalities. Suppose, God forbid, that you go out of here and then you get mugged. Oh dear. You get hurt, and the ambulance has to come along and haul you off to the hospital, and the nurses do this, the doctors do that. All those are economic activities which are added on to GDP for all the world as if it was enhancing your lifestyle fulfillment of nonsense. And supposing the police come and they run after the mugger and they catch him, and then they put him in court, and he's convicted and sent to prison, all those things are added on to GDP. Now, if we subtracted them, as would be more rational, we'd then end up with a line like this, genuine progress indicator, and note how it reached a peak in the late 1970s, and until then, until just recently, it's been more or less flat that we were going on. Well, I'd like to put this thought to you, and I'd really like to hear your views. Do you think that the growth in the economy, in the conventional economy as traditionally measured, must always lead directly to growth in human lifestyle fulfillment? Are you better off? Do you feel they're better off? There was a public opinion survey in Britain did just a little while ago. It turns out that since 1970, the amount of money coming in through the door in a typical British household, the amount of money has doubled during the period 1970 to 2005. But if you ask those same people, well, okay, but do you feel twice as fulfilled? Do you feel twice as, very good word here, do you feel twice as happy? And nobody says yes. In fact, a lot of them say that growth in the economy is being purchased at the cost of a decline in lifestyle fulfillment, because the expanding economy is brought to the price of more rush, more pollution, less time to spend on relationships, whether with the partner or the kids or the neighbours, relatives, or just sitting a beer on the back porch. Less and less time for all those things, more pollution. I'd like to hear from you, especially from those of you who are starting on your careers and your earning capacity. But would you agree that we may be at a stage where growth in the economy no longer leads to growth in what we really want? As Al Gore has said, we want lives that make us better off. So, lifestyles that make us better off. But how about lifestyles that are simply better? I'd like to hear your views in a while. Let's move on. Perverse subsidies. Despite the activities of lobbyists, some perverse subsidies are being gradually phased out. Top category: India, China, Russia, Mexico / fossil fuel subsidies. They didn't do it voluntarily. They have the IMF told them to do it. Note at the bottom: South Africa, Australia, Mexico, and the US, say California and UK, have set up water markets which are functioning quite productively and lead to much more efficiency. But we have to find ways to get more work out of every gallon of water or gallon of gasoline or lump of coal. We're still a long way off achieving that. Energy efficiency. How are we doing, Stuart?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, that's a measure of how far, of how much real progress we could achieve if we were to define the question accurately, concisely, and then get on with the job. This is the house of Amy Levins, I've heard of him. He lives at 6,500 feet in the Colorado Rockies. It is cold there. There are 100 days in winter when the temperature never gets above freezing. It is chilly. And yet, as you see at the top, his house is so well insulated and has a few solar panels that he rejoices in winter because he makes all his own electricity and actually has a surplus that he sells to the national grid. He makes money from freezing temperatures in winter. Another example of how the marketplace doesn't always work as well as we are led to believe. The traditional economics is inclined to say, in some quarters at any rate, that the marketplace is the fount of all wisdom, so it can't go wrong. Well, look at the next to the bottom. Jelly sweets to Italy, from UK to Italy, and jelly sweets coming in the opposite direction. And one person suggested, but why don't they simply swap recipes? I think that's the point. I don't want to present a picture of gloom and doom, wall-to-wall gloom and doom. There are some quite positive signs that we can get in life. Top with optimist and pessimist. I'm sometimes asked if I am hopeful, and I'm reminded of the person who defined optimist and pessimist, proclaiming that an optimist urges this is the best of all possible worlds, to which the pessimist responds, I'm afraid you're right. There are a lot of breakthroughs. Let's not be too down on some. Fertility has declined in 3 countries, Iran, Iran, Thailand and Kenya, the fertility rate has plunged. Example of how they've done it. In Thailand, if you switch on the radio in the morning at 8 o'clock, you'll hear the announcer say, "Ladies, have you taken your pill today?" And at 6 o'clock in the evening, the announcer says, "Gentlemen, have you packed your condom for this evening?" Whatever impact that has, the fertility. In 1975, the Thailand government, backed by sentiment among the populace, wanted to bring down their fertility rate from 6.5 to 2 as fast as they could move, and they said they'd do it in 30 years. The experts said, forget it, no one's ever achieved a breakthrough like that. Thailand didn't take 30 years, it took only 25 years. It can be done. Montreal Protocol, the big success story, I'm sure you're familiar with it. And then we've got a list of extraordinary advances and breakthroughs. Berlin Wall, South Africa, US smoking, New Zealand sheep subsidies. And I would add to that, really, the events of last Tuesday. I think that potentially that's a breakthrough that matches the plan of the Berlin Wall. Finally, biodiversity hotspots, $850 million mobilised to safeguard 35 hotspots around the world. Did you know that in just 2.5% of Earth's surface, there are the last remaining habitats of almost half of all Earth species? If we could lock away those hotspots, which would be very difficult, but if we could, we'd knock a huge dent in the whole mass extinction we'd be about. To achieve the reforms that I've been outlining, with regard shifting from GDP to GPI and so on, we will need a lot of activist public opinion, and generally that's a resource in very short supply. But there are some good signs, especially in this country with your great democratic traditions. 800 mayors in all 50 states with over 30 million citizens, and these are figures from earlier this year, that are quite a bit higher by now, are striving to meet and beat Kyoto. You have great good news, and I'm sure President Obama will motor off down the road, if that's an appropriate phrase, even faster. We'll skip over that one. There's no doubt that achieving the changes I'm proposing, even at a time when they say even when you say good morning, you're likely to hear someone say, yes, that'll be a change, and we can do it. It is difficult to achieve a fundamental shake-up of the way that society tries to run its affairs and what it thinks is appropriate and necessary and achievable. This from 500 years ago, what we've been talking about is no new problem, and it is very, very difficult. But it can be done if enough people want to move in that direction. I'll expand on that a bit more in a moment. But I want to show you a final slide, which I think is somehow, I'm not quite sure how, is related to what we've been talking about, and we're very glad to. Is that 5 goals or 5 minutes?
5 goals or 5 minutes, your preference.
Okay. Have a look at this and to tell me if this slide does belong here. Is it related? Or is the connection a bit too laboured?
Sad.
Anyway, a final thought. Going like this, which I'll direct to the students here, who still have their lives ahead. I suggest to you that you live at a very privileged time, an extremely fortunate time. The problems of tackling the world and the earth are of a scale and character that has never been witnessed before, ever since we came out of our caves 10,000 years ago. There's no doubt we are in a lot of trouble. There is also no doubt at all that for the first time in history we possess the means to knock all these problems out of our way and get on with trying to live truly civilized. So on the one hand, unprecedented problems, on the other hand, unprecedented solutions. Yours is, I often get up in the morning and I can't wait to get out of the door and get on with the job, because I feel I'm so fortunate to be living at a time that is so unprecedented. I'm a member of a generation that can fix all these things, and if we do, I think we'll feel 10 feet tall to an extent that no other gang of people in the past has ever enjoyed. We can do these things, and we're the only generation that will have this chance. Why is that? Well, it's the challenge has never risen in the past because the problems weren't there. And the chance for us to stand tall won't arise in the future, because if we don't fix these problems, then people down the road, the next generation, will have nothing left to do but to pick up the pieces off the floor that we pass on to them. It's up to us at this time. Would you agree with me that this is a superb time to be alive, when we can tackle all these problems? Turn these appalling problems into glorious opportunities. There's no doubt at all whether we could do it. And there's also no doubt in my mind, based on lots of empirical evidence in support, that I would not like to be a problem that gets in the way of Duke students. Thank you.
I know as question master that I stand between you and hors d'oeuvres and drinks, but Norman has agreed to answer a few questions, so please have at him. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about agricultural subsidies, but a lot of economists would argue that agricultural subsidies and homegrown agriculture in general has a positive externality of national security or a security benefit. Do you believe that the argument of that benefit is invalid, or that we are having an issue equating the social market benefit of that externality, the social market cost, and overstating the subsidies?
Well, up till about 20 years ago, I thought there is a security angle to agriculture. Every country likes to go as far as it can to feed itself, but every country also imports a lot of food from outside. Your country supplies grain to over 100 countries. But things are different now with climate change. Not all countries can aim to be self-sufficient in food. In fact, a good deal less opportunity to become self-sufficient than was the case 20 years ago. So I think we should do more to reckon. Okay, I'll push my boat out and say that this is a time when we are not so much Americans and Britishers and residents of Nankaku and land. We are first and foremost joint citizens of one world. But if I go to the airport on Friday afternoon and have in my hand that silly little bit of cardboard that says I'm a citizen of Great Britain, I feel that on environmental grounds and all the multiple linkages that engage in throughout my day from the time I get up in the morning, and because of economic linkages as well, we are surely first and foremost citizens of one world. So we can't talk about countries becoming self-sufficient in agriculture the way we could quite recently. Does that respond to what you were saying?
Maybe somewhat. I was just wondering if your position was to eliminate agricultural subsidies altogether, because there is still that argument of security. The argument is that we are so interconnected, it's impossible to be sufficient in the face of national security argument.
I don't think. Do we really have anything? Do we really strive anymore for what is called national security? Isn't there only international security? Mrs. Bexley? Anyway, We'll move on beyond agriculture.
The dean has a question.
Tell me about the genuine progress indicator, index, what is it, indicator?
Yes.
Who's calculating that and how do they do it, do you know?
There's an organisation called, what's it called? There's one office in Oakland, California. Redefining progress, yes. And what's the one in San Francisco? Anyway, they're the ones who do these calculations. They're available in most accessible form in the annual report of the United Nations Development Programme. It's a report called the Human Development Report, and it's got 300 or 400 pages jam-packed full with statistics about how the index have been developed and how far it's a reasonable reflection of the world outside the window.
Thank you.
Can anybody suggest any other sources? There are lots of other sources. There's what is called an index of sustainable welfare. I think that's put out by the World Bank.
I remember hearing about the green GDP.
I'm sorry?
The green GDP.
Yes. I feel that is implicitly accepting that the traditionalist way of measuring the economy is not susceptible to a bit of tweaking here and there. We need something more radical.
So I understand that, but would it be fair to say that the index, like the genuine products indicator, is subject to some subjective judgments?
Yeah, yes, indeed, because so some of the factors that are weighed there are not just price of carrots or whatever, but also include yes, very subjective assessments like human relationships. So somebody produced a list a little while ago trying to measure which are the happiest countries in the world, and they looked at things like human relationships and health and literacy and the role of women and environment and all kinds of things. And a lot of those factors have to be assessed and appraised by a kind of seat of the pants judgment. But that's better than keeping quiet about them, because that implies that they don't exist.
Well, I think that the usefulness of that is to show the difference. I don't know that I think it's a very interesting comparison. To say there's clearly a very significant difference. I think people might argue about exactly what a progress indicator would be, but it certainly suggests that there's a major difference between the GDP.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, would you on the whole agree that, as the Dean has just pointed out, that there's a great and growing divergence between growth in the traditional economy as conventionally measured, and on the other hand, what makes people tick and what makes them tick better?
I think there's a threshold. I think there's probably a point below which GDP and happiness correlate, and then it reaches a threshold where they possibly converge. In other words, if you're starving, if you're most of your babies die. So
Sure. Well, that's some of the developing world economists and March SN of how that they have figured that while you're climbing up to a level of $10,000, your life is materially enhanced if you have money coming through the door to $10,000. But after that, the marginal benefit declines quite rapidly. If you're earning $50,000, is there much point in striving to earn $150,000 or $70,000? What do you think? I keep raising this question with you, and the silence.
The Dean will be very happy to adjust people's salaries.
Or upward, whatever.
And then they has a question.
yeah, so I was very interested in your plot of percentage of water cost attributed by nation attributed that is charged to the person. In other words, Israel does 60%, but the remaining cost is still being charged to the individual just through each government. Isn't that correct? In other words, in the form, if I'm trying to understand that that graph. In other words, if we're only paying 25% in the U.S. of the actual cost of water, presumably that's on an individual basis in the form of my water bill and my sewer bill and so forth. But the cost of building the dam or so forth is being accounted for elsewhere on a governmental
Yes, it is,
basis.
and it should really be accounted for
Individually.
in the cost of the water that comes out of your tap. The water has to be transferred from the dam or reservoir or whatever to your household or your farm, and that's been heavily subsidised. You do pay for that. But there should also be added in the cost of replacing that 1 ton of water or whatever that goes into the pipeline, and that is hardly ever accounted for at all.
The question in the front.
I think the important thing to remember is that the
Okay,
water issue,
Can you hear over there?
and the water issue is that, the society's bearing the undisclosed portion of that water cost. But the important thing is that the signal for that cost is separated from the consumers. So, it's just standard externality. I mean, we see the same thing, the consequences for not properly handling mortgages. We're not lined up with the people that were responsible for those, that fiduciary responsibility. So that's an externality. Anytime we run into these externalities, it causes problems across the board, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I sometimes think that one of the biggest problems today is that we don't have enough feedback loops so that we can pay the full cost of some good or service. I sometimes figure that if I boil the kettle for a cup of coffee, but in fact I boil 2 cups of water because I'm careless or to do something else, that is contributing to the day of one day arrived when a third of Bangladesh is flooded out. And in the meantime, there's no way I can get together with those people and try to negotiate a settlement. And because we're so entwined with other people's lives around the back of the world, and sometimes to their disadvantage, we do need institutional mechanisms that will reflect that fact of one world living. But we're so very smart at technological inventions and motor cars and rockets and that sort of thing. We aren't nearly so clever at developing institutional mechanisms that make sure that we are playing fair with each other. But when you drive your car around and you go to a gas station and you fill it up, and let's say that the pump charges you $4 a gallon, but you know that you should be paying $10 a gallon and another $6. But what can you do? You can't say to the gas station attendant, well, I've paid you $4, but here's more money at $8 or $6. We can't do that. And we can't write a check to the US Treasury and send it up in the mail. What, in fact, can we do except get people to lobby and join in a lobbying campaign to have gasoline charged at $10? But how many people are going to line up for a campaign like that?
One comment to that, and that is, actually we are sending a check to the U.S. Treasury for that money, or somewhere, because we are paying for it. Our grandchildren pay for it. It's just that we don't realize we're paying for it when we buy the product.
You mean that these costs are being paid somewhere? They are real costs.
We're all paying for it.
But they're not being paid. But
Subsidies are paid for through our taxes or in debt.
But we just don't realize it when we're buying a commodity.
Right.
There's a question from the lady to the left here.
I was wondering how you would answer such a question about the environmental business curve that pretty much claims that if you have raising GDP per capita, you start to care more about the environment.
the famous Kuznets curve, that as a nation gets richer, so it'll have some spare cash to fix up its environmental problem. I think it's not the right way to look at these things. But because as a nation is getting richer, so it's producing all kinds of pollutants. It's exploiting all kinds of raw materials and critical natural resources. And the cost of all that lot is on the whole greater than the collective benefits. Have I put in that right?
I understand what you're saying. We have time for a couple more questions before the goodies. You first and then Clinton.
So I was wondering
describe some of the characteristics of an institution that you thought would be able to help us address some of these issues?
Yes. What are the characteristics of an institution that would take care of these issues? What kind of institution would not produce institutional barriers?
Well, the way to ratchet up the price of gasoline so that the cost matches price, so the price matches the cost, is to do it through the tax system. To keep charging more and more for the tax. In fact, in all my 100 visits to your country, I've always known Americans as being fair people. They don't deal in problems, they only deal in solutions. Give them a problem and straight away they'll try to fix it. So I don't understand why there's this fixation on the idea that gasoline at more than $4 a gallon is somehow intrinsically wrong. Yes. That there are all kinds of institutional mechanisms that enable us to square the circle fairly well in some respects, but generally speaking, we don't. We're going to have a drink now. The costs of excessive use of alcohol, which won't arise this evening, of course. The costs of excessive use of alcohol are not reflected in the price. Or consider the fast food trade in this country. It generates a profit of about $110 billion a year. But the social costs of obesity in this country, and diabetes and so on, are about $140 billion. So the fast food trade is a net penalty on the economy. We could fix that by putting a big tax on the hamburger, but that wouldn't be very popular.
The government did it in the form of cigarettes by making it so expensive and it affects behavior.
Clinton has a question.
Since the whole world's kind of like panicked about our financial crisis and everything, and a lot of that is like a decline in GDP, and so everybody's saying the sky is falling. You think there's an opportunity to really push for some of these kind of fundamental structural changes, because that would give us a better measure of what the situation is. Just because if a lot of rich people lose all their money on paper, the GDP declines a lot. But for most people, like maybe their quality of life has not changed a lot unless those people shut down the businesses and they lose their jobs. But it's kind of that
good point.
distortion.
Very good point. I've often thought. If you say to people, okay, your lifestyle is not so affluent as it was 6 months ago, and it's going to go down still further. Suppose your lifestyle goes down to the level of affluence that you enjoyed, say, in 1970. Would that be all that so dreadful? In fact, in some respects, it might be better. Of course, if you lose your job, if you lose your house, then the penalties are very concentrated.
No one else, an undergraduate in 1970, and I was hungry.
It wasn't
I go back to 1970, living on mince beef loaf in Afghanistan. One more question before we go to break. Anybody want to have a quick question? Okay, Norman, thank you very much.